So let's jump into the reading. We'll start with the Leadham reading. I see that one as the most philosophical of the three. And the the gist of the Leadham reading is that they are taking two pretty much polar opposite paradigms, one of them being the positivist paradigm and the other being the sense making paradigm. I know they always call it positivism slash classical and sense making slash constructivism, but just for the efficiency of our conversation, I'm just going to call it positivism versus sense making. Um, anyway, throughout the article, they sort of pit these two paradigms against each other and they look at how these paradigms have implications or what sorts of underlying assumptions these paradigms have about data, information, and different kinds of knowledge, right? Of course, the authors of the article are not shy at all about exposing their opinions of which is the quote unquote better paradigm. I don't necessarily buy into their thinking in that particular way. I see room and necessity um, for thinking and systems and perspectives that come from both paradigms. But you know that's what they gave us, and it's still a useful conversation to have to look critically at both of the paradigms and to look at the influences of the paradigm on interpreting and encompassing information. So the positivist paradigm, according to Leadham and colleagues, um, the epistemology of the positivist paradigm says that reality or truth or what have you is observable and measurable. This sort of comes from the scientific method and that same sort of school of thought and logic. That which cannot be empirically detected cannot be included in our assumptions and conclusions about the world. So that second sentence really gets at the epistemology part of the paradigm. Is positivism says that if you can't measure or detect, then you can't make any assumptions based on unmeasurable or undetectable information. The positivist ontology says that when you come across data or information, it will belong to one or more of a fixed set of categories. So, ontology believes that all of the categories in the world are pre existing, have always existed, and always will exist. So, that's what makes them fixed. The categories are objectively true. The categories are the same no matter what culture you come from, no matter what perspective you have, no matter if you're in the northern hemisphere or the southern hemisphere, day or night, none of it matters. The categories of the world are always the same. So truth is truth no matter who you are or where you are. That's sort of the positivist paradigm. The sense making paradigm, on the other hand, has this epistemology. Reality is relative and experiential. What one person experiences as true is that person's truth, regardless of its verifiability by anyone else. So the sense making epistemology, the relative just means that it's relativistic, as in you can compare my truth to your truth, and there might be some overlaps between the two, but we allow that truth is a dynamic or fluid kind of concept, or reality is even a dynamic or fluid kind of concept because everyone has different experiences, everyone has different constructions. If we look a little bit forward to the Lamone reading, um, so everyone has different ways of knowing and different ways of constructing knowledge. So the sense making ontology says that data and information are defined dynamically and situationally based on their effect on a person or situation. That just means that the same piece of reality or truth can mean entirely different things depending on who's interpreting them or what the situation is in which the data or information are being used. I will say that this session's discussion is putting a little bit more emphasis on the sense making side of things, so I'm sounding a little bit legitimistic in the lecture tonight, but we'll see next week where the positivistic side comes in when we work with information systems. The evaluation and testing of information systems comes from a more system oriented perspective, which is much more positivist than the user oriented perspective. Like I said last week and tonight, there is room for both perspectives, and that they each have their role in the design and understanding and theory and practice of information systems and information organization. Moving on to the Limon reading then. Limon wrote the article about constructivism as a learning theory for the Encyclopedia of Education. So I see the constructivist learning theory as part philosophy, part psychology. It's philosophy in that it's sort of the natural consequence. It just completely springs forth from that sense-making paradigm that was described by Leadham in the previous reading. Constructivism says that learning is active and learning causes a change in the learner. People learn by solving problems. They are constructing new knowledge in their own minds. So if you think of the physical act of construction as the building and integrating of structures, you can think of the construction of knowledge very much the same way. If we have cognitive structures, or what Skimp likes to call schemas, then learning means constructing new schemas, or sort of building an addition onto an existing schema based on the whatever the stimulus is that one is learning from. Learning is sense making. We make sense of what we know at any given moment in time. So if you know something walking into a situation and then you learn something new, you need to make sense of the new information by integrating it with your existing knowledge. So what you know going into the situation is going to affect what you're able to learn and how you go about learning it based on which of those existing cognitives or existing schemas you choose to integrate the information with. And that brings us right into Skimp. So I think the Skimp readings are really useful for us as information professionals. Skimp says that how we form and populate concepts in our minds comes forth from the processes of abstraction and classification. Roughly speaking, abstraction is the process of understanding new categories, and classification is the process of identifying members of those categories. So it says on the slide, abstraction is something learned that enables us to classify. Skimp gives the examples of the shapes. In order to understand a particular shape, one must learn the rules and characteristics of that shape. Classification is once you have sort of undergone the act of abstraction and created abstract understanding of certain shapes, then collecting together examples of the abstraction based on their similarities and assimilating them into that concept or category is the act of classification. So when someone has created a concept for the rules of a shape, like a circle, they can then classify objects as members or not members of that group. So later on in chapter 2, Skimp goes on to say that naming is for communication and classification. When we're working in the information professions, we do need to look at naming, because how concepts get labeled will have a lot to do with how accessible they are to the people who want to use those labels to seek and use information. So we need to keep that in mind, that a name or label is the nature of the label is inextricably tied to the semantics or the essence of whatever it is that is being labeled. In chapter 3, Skimp talks about a schema. He says that a schema is the structure that results when one interrelates two or more concepts. The good thing about our schemas, according to Skimp, is that there are tools for future learning. When you form a schema, you're doing a form of learning. You're sort of cognitively building associations between certain concepts that naturally go together. Like if you think of a purchase transaction. You have a certain schema about buying and selling that says that there is a vendor and there is a buyer, there is some sort of currency that gets exchanged and some sort of product or service that is traded for the currency. There's this concept of value, and all of those are sort of little pieces in your schema having to do with sales transaction. To understand something, Skemp says, is to assimilate it into the appropriate schema. So if you're going to understand what a cash register is used for, then if you assimilate it into the schema of things for constructing a house, you're probably misunderstanding the proper use of a cash register. But if you assimilate it into the schema of sales transactions, that's probably more appropriate. You could also assimilate a cash register into a schema having to do with things that are manufactured or things that come off an assembly line. That would be another appropriate and additional schema into which cash register could be assimilated. Now, there are at least two downsides to schemas that Skemp discusses. One is that schemas can be perpetuating. Once you have an existing schema and you see a new example of information, if the example of information or concept jibes with your current schema, it's going to be easier for you to assimilate that information and to reinforce your existing schema. It's going to get stronger and stronger because you're going to find positive examples of something that you already understand. But unfortunately, if you have information that doesn't fit into an existing schema, it's not going to have anything to stick to. And so that's probably information that you won't be as able to absorb. And so your existing schemas are sort of, while they're making it more possible for you to add to your existing schema, it is extremely difficult to build new schemas, especially as we get older and our brains aren't as elastic as they were as children. And you either have to build a new schema in order to understand a new concept, or the concept just sort of, falls by the wayside and you don't assimilate it into your knowledge. So that's what he means by self-perpetuating schemas. And also the difficulty of creating new schemas. Now, another downside of the difficulty of creating new schemas is that it can cause mislearning. So if something new fits a little bit into an existing schema, you might add it into a schema that it doesn't belong to. That's another possible downfall of schematic learning. But all that being said, schemas are very powerful tools, and I think it is a legitimate theory for how cognition and learning work.